it's a great pleasure to be here tonight, and especially to be speaking at an event for this council. It's a body I know that does a lot of important work in Queensland. I have a lot to do with the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties, and this is an area where we certainly need as much cooperation as we can. There's big campaigns that need to be fought. There's a lot of problems within the legal system, and at a time like this, bodies like the council, I think, are especially important. What I've been asked to talk about tonight is something that is the focus now of a national campaign, and that is the powers that have been granted to ASIO, and they're extraordinary powers. They're powers that not only rival but exceed those found within the United States when it comes to terrorism and even the detention of asylum seekers. And it's something now that the New South Wales Council has begun to fight, and with the Queensland Council, other bodies like Amnesty, Get Up and the like, what they're seeking to do is actually to get some of these powers rolled back, to argue that within a democracy such as Australia, the powers I'm going to talk about tonight have no place, and that we not only need to be vigilant about the exercise of these powers, we actively need to resist them on the basis that they should not and cannot be seen as a permanent part of Australia's legal system. What I'm going to do is focus on two types of these powers, which really are the focus of this campaign. And I'd certainly encourage you to get involved in that if you'd like to do so. You can go to the New South Wales Council's website, or there might also be information on the Queensland Council's website. I'll start by talking a bit about the context to these powers, how we got some of these anti-terror powers, these national security powers, and then I'm going to get the sharp end. I'm going to look particularly at the powers that ASIO still has to question and detain non-suspects, to essentially disappear Australian citizens for up to a week, to ask them questions about terrorism and other matters. And then I'm going to also look and finish at a bit of an analysis of the ability of ASIO to have asylum seekers detained for lengthy periods on the basis of an adverse security certificate. And these are matters that, of course, have the potential to have a dramatic impact upon the quality of people's lives. They're real issues that do need to be debated, and yet they're issues that get very little attention within the mainstream media, so it is a great pleasure to be talking about them tonight. Well, by way of background to the national security laws that enable these type of powers, if you look back to September 11 and those dramatic events, and you look at the statute book across Australia at that time, we had no national laws at that point directed specifically at terrorism. Terrorism was an unknown concept on the federal statute book. September 11 changed all that. It was a matter both, I think, of properly responding to the threat in Australia and overseas, and also, I think, a matter of political opportunism of the time. What we got at that point was a litany of new laws enacted by a federal parliament here in Queensland and around the states, which for the first time set up an enormous apparatus for dealing with the problems of terrorism within Australia and the region. Now, I'm actually someone who believes we did need a legal response to September 11. I think we do need on our books laws that properly criminalise terrorism. We do need to make sure that our agencies such as ASIO have appropriate, proportionate powers over things like surveillance and other means to prevent the commission of terrorist attacks in Australia. For me, it's not a matter of opposing anti-terror laws, it's a matter of asking the question, have we actually got the balance right? Do we have laws which are proportionate to the threat? Do we have laws which are actually tailored to safeguarding our democracy? Or do we have laws which actually can prove dangerous to that democracy in terms of the precedents they establish and in terms of the powers that they give to secret agencies? So my starting point is to actually say that governments do deserve a measure of credit for recognising that the statute book was wrongly bare when it comes to terror laws in Australia. Where, though, we got it wrong was in the nature of the laws we enacted and the excessive nature of those laws when it comes particularly to fundamental democratic rights and civil liberties within Australia. But before I get to the specifics of those laws, just to give you a sense of perspective, and people forget just what an active period this was. Between September 11 and the end of the following decade, Australia enacted 54 pieces of anti-terror legislation. That's 54 separate national laws, not even including the state laws. 48 of those were passed in the 6 years between September 11 and the fall of the Howard government in 2007. And it meant over that 6 years, we averaged a new anti-terror law through our federal parliament every 6.8 weeks. And that kept me extraordinarily busy, as you can imagine. And I know organisations like yours extraordinarily busy. We went from no law on the topic to a new law being passed roughly every 7 weeks for a period of 6 years. And that meant that we went from having no laws on the topic to a regime that rivals any in the world and in fact exceeds those of other comparable nations. It's no surprise, given that Australia had no experience of enacting these laws, that we did it so quickly, that we responded to attacks overseas with almost a desperation to get new law on the books, that we made serious errors in the natures of the laws that were enacted. But what unfortunately we've had since that time is what I'd call an extreme reluctance on the part of our political leaders to grasp the need to revisit these laws, to recognise that even if there were the best intentions, it would be unlikely you'd get everything right, that you need to recalibrate the laws in light of lessons learned and also in light of the diminishing threat. But that has not happened, and so what we have today is an extraordinary burst of lawmaking, complete with a range of problems that is still on the statute book. And that is something that Australians tend, I wouldn't even say complacent about, that assumes knowledge but completely ignorant of. In fact, most of the time when I talk to groups about these laws, they assume the laws aren't on the books anymore. That was surely for the emergency that we had around the Bali attacks, the London bombings. But of course these by and large are permanent laws, there are few exceptions, and they're laws that will remain on the statute book until we see a change. I would say that this is not the experience of other countries. The United Kingdom has already begun to wind back some of these laws, and they've passed some important legislation under a Conservative government to actually recognise, in the view there of their legal officers, that they went too far. The United States also is seeing some winding back of these laws, too slowly, I would see. But Australia is distinctive not just in how far we have gone, but in just how unwilling we are to actually grapple with the need to revisit the laws that were enacted. In terms of the number of laws, which is a striking statistic, one every 7 weeks, that's something that when international commentators look at it, they are just stunned at what Australia did during this period. One person who's written the leading work on this internationally has a whole chapter devoted to Australia under the title of hyper-legislation. That chapter concludes that Australia exceeded the United Kingdom, the United States and Canada in the sheer number of new anti-terror laws that we enacted. There is no comparable nation in just how much was done in that period of time. So it's under that heading of hyper-legislation. I'll give you a quick sense of what some of these laws do before focusing in more sharply on the ASIO powers that I want to look at. The laws start by defining what terrorism means, and that's something itself which is a very slippery and difficult thing to do, because of course one person's terrorist is certainly another person's freedom fighter. It means under the Australian definition, which is essentially if you commit a violent act or if you harm a computer system in order to advance a political, religious or ideological cause, that we without doubt capture within our definition people such as Nelson Mandela. There is no exception under the Australian definition for people fighting against apartheid. There's no doubt that the people in Syria fighting against that regime are terrorists. There's no doubt that people in East Timor who fought against Indonesia are terrorists. That's because we have a very inclusive definition with no attempt to actually sift out the sort of acts of violence or resistance that, at least with the benefit of hindsight, would tend to be regarded as acceptable. Nelson Mandela has never been prosecuted under Australia's anti-terror laws, but that's simply because the authorities have never decided to do so. It seems a ridiculous thing, of course, that they would do so, but it gives you a hint as to just how much of these laws are dependent upon the discretion of the political arm of government. They're exercised according to what they think is appropriate, not according to a well-tailored law that says to the community clearly what the limits of that law should be. Once you've got the definition of terrorism, you've got a range of new criminal offences, and these go further than the criminal law has previously in Australia, and not just attacking the commission of a crime, but planning for that crime. And it goes even further back than that, in that many of the recent prosecutions had been for conspiracy to attempt to prepare to plan for a terrorist attack. And if you think about all of those elements, conspiracy itself is quite nebulous. Attempt, so you haven't actually committed, but perhaps you have attempted to do it. You haven't actually done the attack, you've just prepared to plan, because it's the preparation itself that's something that the laws target. It means that people are being jailed for very lengthy periods of time, 20 years plus, for basically having conversations about preparation for terrorism without actually having committed an intention to engage in the act. Now, I think it is appropriate that we go further back in the chain of causation, that we do target preparation, but we're dealing here with the most serious offences on the statute book, and it means that people are being jailed much longer than for crimes of rape and even murder in circumstances where they've simply engaged with a group in order to prepare to plan. We've got the banning of terrorist organisations, we've got control orders for up to a year. David Hicks and Jack Thomas were subject to control orders. Jack Thomas was subjected to a control order when he was actually at one point acquitted on the basis that evidence couldn't be admitted against him. We've got preventative detention without trial for up to 2 weeks. The Attorney General can issue a certificate to close courts from public view, and suppression orders are very, very common in this area. The onus of proof is reversed for critical aspects of some offences. We have now the secret interception of emails, SMSs, and other communications, not of suspects, but of innocent people. We've now got warrantless searches, including of people's homes. We also had, though thankfully these have now gone, sedition laws, which enable people to be jailed for up to 7 years, not for their actions, but for their speech. And one of my favourites, new rules of censorship, which don't get much attention. But these are particularly ridiculous because they enable the banning of books, movies and the like, not because actually they're about terrorism, but because the book, for example, directly praises the doing of a terrorist act in circumstances where there's a risk that that might lead someone else to commit terrorism. So merely saying a form of terrorism is good, such as Nelson Mandela's struggle, is enough to lead to the book being banned. And where they talk about a risk it'll lead someone to commit a terrorist act, the law is explicit in saying that that includes people who have a mental impairment. And it means that if you writing something might lead someone with a mental impairment to think about terrorism, well, that publication can be banned. I mean, it's a ridiculous provision that you could ever even attempt to guess at what such a person might be thinking. What these examples demonstrate is, in the context of these ASIO powers, is that during the last decade or more, Australia has enacted what I think is the greatest assault on civil liberties since Federation, in terms of the sheer volume and scope of the laws enacted in this area. There's certainly been no element in our history where you have seen such a great body of legislation passed on any one topic in such a short period of time, or it's had such an impact on civil liberties. Certainly it doesn't compare to World War II and World War I, even the national security regulations of that time. It's quite remarkable just how far this legislation goes. Now, some people might say that, well, some of this law isn't being used. We've never had, for example, preventative detention. The censorship provisions aren't used very much, so it doesn't matter if the laws just sit on the statute book. But even though that's true, fortunately the laws are not, by and large, being abused. What we are seeing is they're becoming accepted as normal, rather than exceptional. Things that some years ago were seen as running against the grain, things that were inconsistent with our democracy, are now, by virtue of their longevity, being seen as something that is actually a bit of a precedent for things that can be done elsewhere. We're seeing that, for example, in the copying of the control order regime to bikies, not only in Queensland but in other states. And that's actually been a deliberate copying of the Antiterror control order regime to apply to serious organised crime. In South Australia, the Premier there, Mike Rann, at the time, said that he needed to extend the anti-terror powers to bikies because, and I quote, "we're allowing similar legislation to that applying to terrorists because bikies are the terrorists within our community." And what we're seeing elsewhere, such as in New South Wales, is the guilt by association elements of the anti-terror laws, or the consorting provisions, also now being enacted into New South Wales law. Those were things that many years ago were removed or discredited, but the anti-terror laws have given them a new lease of life. If it's okay to have these laws for terrorists, why not have them for bikies, drug dealers and a range of others? And indeed, it's in many ways the greatest concern I have is how these laws have provided a toolbox for use within state law and order campaigns.